Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about World of Warcraft Dragonflight and about Shadowlands and why it failed and the mistakes Dragonflight can avoid and may be avoiding based on what I've seen so far, but the mistakes they may avoid making again, because Shadowlands was the first time in WoW's long history, for all the criticism expansions like Warlords of Draenor, Mists of Pandaria, etc. got, Shadowlands was the first time where the game might have just outright died. It came very, very close to it, actually, in a lot of ways. Even though, to this day, there's no genuine competition to take over the WoW player base. And make no mistake about it, there's a lot of people that do like what WoW has to offer in terms of gameplay style. And those people don't have another game to jump onto. Except Final Fantasy, I suppose. But the thing about Final Fantasy is that the style of Final Fantasy, not the gameplay, the balance, the dungeons or raids, rather the style of Final Fantasy just is really off-putting to a lot of people, just plain and simple. I personally detested leveling in Final Fantasy, and I detested the way they tell the story as well in that, with a lot of dialogue and cutscenes that don't have voice lines. Yeah, it can be a bit annoying having to deal with that. And the story isn't particularly great either. The fact that a lot of people do acknowledge about that. But regardless of that, Shadowlands did bring World of Warcraft almost to its knees because of the way they did things. But what were the issues, the major issues of Shadowlands? Well, the first one has to do with Torghast. Torghast was supposed to be this big feature, and it was fun, don't get me wrong. It was fun going through the dungeons a couple of times, getting all that lovely gameplay power that you would get for Torghast, but then it quickly became boring as dirt. And the reason it became boring as dirt is the only reason you were doing Torghast. You weren't doing it for items, you weren't doing it for an actual challenge, because, well, let's be frank about it, outside of some very high levels of Torghast, and even then it comes more so down to your item level than anything else, and maybe the random chance with some of the powers, but outside of some very high levels of it, Torghast was not particularly challenging. It could be very boring, and it could take a lot of hours, and you are not really at risk doing it. So not the level of challenge, not a level of reward, and fundamentally, you're doing Torghast mainly a solo experience or experience with very few other people. You're mainly doing that for currency. You're doing it to make your legendaries and then upgrade your legendaries. It says a lot that in the last patch, they basically made Torghast obsolete. You don't need to do Torghast for any of the currencies. Yes, you do need to get a reputation to get the currencies you need, but compared to the hours and hours and hours and hours spent in Torghast, I'll take doing reputation with Enlightened and any day in Zereth to doing Torghast again. It was boring, it was dull, it was forgettable, and it's not that the gameplay of Torghast is bad, it's just like, we're playing an MMO, we're not playing a single player game. Anything in WoW that you do solo is inherently worse than if you do it with other people, plain and simple. But the thing is, there's just activities that draw people to play together versus activities that push for solo play. Like questing, for instance, is very much a solo experience, regardless of regardless of the difficulty of certain quests. You're pretty much questing on your own. You might group up with some other people, or maybe not really, because you can just tag. Like you no longer have exclusive tagging in WoW, so it doesn't matter anymore. But by and large, when you're questing, you're doing stuff on your own. Torghast was largely a solo experience. Yes, you could play with friends, and it could be fun playing with friends. Like, I had some fun playing with a Warlock friend of mine, and he could just summon an army of Infernals that could smash everything in their path. That was fun. That was absolutely fun. But by and large, if you're doing Torghast solo, it was boring as dirt. And that's just part of the aspect. The Maw also was supposed to be a big feature with a reputation, with sockets and other things being gained from the Maw. Great deal of power, but ended up being very boring, very frustrating as hell, especially since you couldn't mount in the Maw, and you could only get that much later on, and only with special mounts until the next content patch gave players the ability to mount up in the Maw. But by that point, honestly, it's like we were just so sick and tired. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Sanctum of Domination is overall a pretty solid raid, but everything else, like the raiding in Shadowlands is overall pretty solid. I'd say the Sanctum and Nafria are great raids. The Mythic Dungeons, pretty good. The Sepulchre, honestly, outside of a couple of bosses, I'm not impressed by the Sepulchre. Not even all of the raiding content is that great. When it comes to like the final raiding tier, is like I'll take Sylvanas and I'll take Nafria any day over any boss, including the Jailer in the Sepulchre. Just not particularly impressive. Felt mediocre in a lot of ways. And yeah, Nafria was great a couple of times, don't get me wrong, an amazing raid, but then you encounter other issues. When you got, like every expansion has raiding and now every expansion has Mythic Dungeons, and Blizzard hasn't completely screwed up on that. Like if you want to see the complete death of World of Warcraft, wait until they release a horrible raiding tier combined with all the other issues Shadowlands had. That's going to be a swift demise to the game. But the problem with Torghast and the problem with the Maw is you can just skip on it. It's not that it's horrible gameplay, it's like it's mandatory horrible gameplay that any serious player has to do to a degree or another. That's what ruined the game in a lot of ways. And then you've got the Renown system, which is like level up basically this kind of special reputation, get higher levels of Renown to unlock class power. Completely miserable experience, and it's like, oh, you want to unlock significant bonus, you also have to do a bunch of boring ass story quests that offer no level challenge, that don't have an interesting story. So yeah, the Renown system, utter crap. The Torghast, very boring. The Maw, very boring. And the worst part about the Renown system, like, you could skip to a degree Torghast, and you could skip to a degree the Maw. You didn't have to do it to do everything. But if you skipped on Renown, that was a lot of class power you're throwing out the door. Like, without Renown, you're missing out on a great deal of abilities. You're missing out not only on the abilities each Soulbind is giving you, but also missing out on the conduits. Let's not even get into the conduit level and the nonsense that was associated with that with the Pyro-powered system. So Renown gave you a lot, but it was also a fairly miserable grind, especially when you could only increase Renown, or one of the big ways to increase Renown was from Anima. Because I do love farming a bunch of pointless Anima just to increase a reputation level. I mean, reputation grinds, I feel, should take a hike in World of Warcraft in a lot of ways, or should be made in such a way that they don't really matter. From my perspective, like if you want to have reputation grinds, which the Renown system ultimately is, I mean, it can add flavor, but when you're having to do it just for the sake of being on the same level as everyone else from a gameplay standpoint, well, I love raiding, I can love Mythic Dungeons, but I absolutely have no interest in the story content, the solo content in World of Warcraft, because I think it's fundamentally pretty weak. Gameplay-wise, it's not interesting at all, even when they do try and make interesting objective. Challenging, it's not challenging ever. It's frustrating most of the time. Like, when they add the challenge in solo content, what really ends up happening for me is not, I'm not challenged, I'm just spending 20 minutes to deal with a boss in Torghast, for instance. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's like, I'm not really at risk, I'm just bored out of my mind when I'm dealing with that. And that's how a lot of the Renown questing experience felt like, that's how the Maw felt like, that's how Torghast felt like, bored completely out of my mind. And again, if you want your character to be relevant, you had to do this. You had to do the Renown, you had to do Torghast, and yes, you had to do the Maw to an extent, though I think the Maw was the least relevant one, but the Venari reputation, yeah, that's very relevant content over there. Again, there are some ways of getting past that, but Blizzard just feels like they have to add some mandatory grind. But here's the thing, we had mandatory grinds before in World of Warcraft. It used to be like for your legendary ring, you would have to farm for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. But the thing is, when you were doing that, yes, you had some story content with your legendary ring or cloak. You had some story content, and that was not exactly that fun. But ultimately, most of the grinding that you were doing was done through actually raiding in the game, for actually doing the PvE content, not being forced to do a bunch of solo pointless crap in the game. That's what I think the difference is between what we had before and what we have in Shadowlands. Now, to be clear, I personally skipped out on raiding a Legion, but even with Legion, like when you look at Legion and the things you had to do, yeah, Legion was not too bad either in terms of like the content that you had to do on your own. But having to farm basically renown levels, Torghast levels, and Maw levels, it's like not fun, not really fun. It is impressive how Torghast, which seemed very interesting initially, ended up being such a miserable failure. And this brings me to Dragonflight. What are we going to get in Dragonflight that's going to be better? Well, based on what I've seen, we still have the renown level, though it's renowned with individual factions, basically the reputation grind. But based on the rewards that I'm seeing, there's not really huge relevancy there. Yes, it's some customization options and maybe some reputation benefits, some profession benefits, but in a lot of ways, looking at Dragonflight, you are not going to have a constant insufferable grind throughout the entirety of the expansion that's going to drag you down. That's good. That is very good. However, there is the elephant in the room, because all the issues I've talked about are gameplay issues, gameplay design issues, if you will, that are related to the way Blizzard handled the gameplay of the expansion. Renown, Torghast, the Maw, they're all gameplay. Poorly handled. Very poorly handled, don't get me wrong. Very, very poorly handled. Like, here's what I would say to Blizzard if I was talking to them. You gotta understand, we're playing an MMO. We want to play with other people. We want content to reward us for playing and interacting with other people. Stop trying to make the game a solo experience when your game sucks in that perspective, and it will always suck. I don't care how well they try, it's never gonna be as good from a solo experience as other games can be. Like, a solo game can be fun even when you're steamrolling everything. WoW is just not built for that, because the fundamental class gameplay is built around playing in a group, playing with other people. Soloing is dull. It always has been dull. And if Blizzard can't comprehend that, well, I don't know what the hell they're working on. And if also Blizzard can't comprehend that we despise having mandatory weekly grinds in the game, then I don't know what they're thinking about, really. I mean, I guess they want people to feel like they're putting in some effort and they're working towards something. But again, if what I have to do is to solo stuff or do world quests or all that garbage that exists in the game, then that is not fun. That's not engaging. That's just a huge time sink. That's wasting my time. Don't get me wrong, previous expansions didn't necessarily have it better, but I'll gladly take what I had to do in WoD, for instance. Like, yeah, I know a lot of people despise WoD, but honestly, it wasn't too bad. Like, if you started halfway through Warlords of Draenor, it was a much, much better experience than people give it credit for. I would rather take WoD than the garrison system, which for a lot of people was one of the lowest points in the game, compared to dealing with the garbage of Shadowlands. I really would, in a lot of ways. So that's one thing, but the elephant in the room, the toxic player base. Oh yeah, the absolutely toxic player base. It is actually quite impressive. I've played essentially every single expansion of World of Warcraft, with the exception of Legion and Battle for Azeroth, but every single one, on retail, every single one. I raided in them, I did content with other people in them, I've pugged, I've raided in guilds. I have not seen any other point in the entire history of the game in terms of toxicity as it is currently, as it has been in Shadowlands, and as I expect it to all be in Dragonflight. And I think that some of the decisions that Blizzard is making actually with Dragonflight may increase the toxicity. Because what are they doing with Mythic Plus? I think a lot of the toxicity comes from Mythic Plus, believe it or not, and partly because of its design in a way. Why is that an issue? Well, let me explain. In Mythic Plus, if people make mistakes, you may fail to run, right? Basically, if you're doing a reasonably high-level Mythic key, or even something like 10, 12, all that, if you screw up, if you do a mispull, if you screw up tactics, if you wipe, God forbid if you wipe, if people die, if a single person dies, then you're likely going to lose the key. So everyone that does Mythic Pluses, so this is where we get Raider.io, and all those wonderful systems, because it's a way to filter people who know what they're doing and people who don't know what they're doing. That's elitism by default. That's pushing people towards elitism, and that's making people not engage with one another. Like, it is funny because long before Classic came out, I made a video how people were not socializing on retail, and some people called me out. I've played Shadowlands. I spent months and months in Shadowlands. I pugged Mythic pluses and raids, and I can tell you the level of socialization in WoW is at an all-time low. Because everyone's going into these dungeons and these raids with the assumption it's like either people are utter garbage or people know exactly what they're doing. There's no middle ground. There's no learning. There's no experience or community aspect. The community is awful in retail World of Warcraft at this point. And we have Classic to compare to that. Like, for all the issues Classic has, for all the JDKPs, for all the problems, for all the bots, Classic does have a much better community. And I think it comes down to the way it's designed. And the way it's designed is not to have gameplay basically in it where if a single person makes a mistake, you fail absolutely everything. Because that, guess what, leads to toxicity, leads to resentment. If you're wiping in a Mythic Plus because a DPSer screwed up their mechanics, or if you're wiping in a raid because the tank doesn't even understand how to taunt, then yeah, you get toxic very quickly. It is very easy to fall into the pit of toxicity. And it's understandable as well when you've been playing the game, and like, I'll give my experience. As a tank, what I do in Mythics, the routes, having to know everything that there is about the dungeon, and that's the default expectation of a lot of people. And then if you screw up in any minor way, if you don't know what you're doing, if God forbid it's your first time doing the dungeon and you don't know everything in advance, you get called out as being a horrible player. Like, this didn't used to be the case. You assumed that people didn't necessarily know what they were doing when they were doing a dungeon the first time. Oh, but there's guides online. Yeah, guess what? A lot of people don't have time, don't care, and a guide is not perfect. If you want to learn to play the game, you play the game. You do the dungeons. You do them again until you learn them. That's how it's supposed to be. That's how it actually is. This assumption that people are going to go into dungeon and content and know exactly what they're going to do, even if you watch a bunch of guides, you would have to spend a ridiculous amount of time to do so, and even then it's not going to compare to the real thing. Anyone who believes otherwise is peddling nonsense as far as I'm concerned when it comes to that. Sure, it would be great if people at least could follow DBM and look up at the adventure guide in game, but the assumption, the expectation really, the mandatory expectation that, say for instance, attack is going to know the exact route, the exact way the mob should be handled, and a lot of the other a lot of things that need to be handled in dungeon even before they stepped into the dungeon for the first time, it is absolutely nonsensical. It is ridiculous to an extreme, but this is what happens because people can blame each other, they can blame other players, but this is what happens, fundamentally what happens when you have a gameplay experience where the main gameplay experience, so to speak, Mythic Pluses, NES rating, Pug rating, basically boil down to either you know what you're doing or you're going to wipe and fail and not achieve anything. That's how it feels like to play on retail. If Blizzard can't understand that, if Blizzard is blind to the kind of toxicity that gets created because of that, then nothing's going to improve when it comes to Dragonflight. I mean, not having to constantly grind for boring, pointless content is certainly going to create better player retention, but even with better player retention from that perspective, it's still going to be a miserable experience to play the game unless you're in a guild. But good luck with that. Good luck finding a guild. Good luck finding a guild, considering how abysmal the community is at this particular point. And has been for a while when it comes to that. I think what Blizzard should do is create reasons for, one, people to learn and grow as players as opposed to being treated like being awful if they don't know everything in advance. They should create they should create a gaming experience to have players grow and learn to be better, not just like, oh, you're dog shit, you're always going to be dog shit, basically. Or you're awful, you have no room to improve, all that. And I'm just trying to prevent myself from giving some of the colorful statements I've received in World of Warcraft. As long as that remains the case, things are going to get worse. And here's the thing, Blizzard is actually making the problem worse. How are they doing that? Because they're making Mythic Plus harder. The loot is going to be less rewarding. And in order to get the similar level of loot, you're going to have to do higher level mythics. And those higher level mythics, based on what I've read, are actually going to be more challenging. I mean, it's not enough that your group can wipe out can wipe in a couple of seconds if someone steps out of line. No. Let's go way overboard. I mean, I get why they're doing it, but I think, and I understand that maybe they're thinking that, oh, if we make it harder, people will have a bigger incentive to raid together. I understand that, right? That would be a worthy cause, but at the same time, a lot of people do like doing Mythic Plus. Like for me personally, I enjoy doing Mythic Plus a lot more than I enjoy raiding, because a lot of raid bosses as a tank just feel like, go do this tank swap mechanic, whereas Mythics do possess a greater deal of personal challenge. Though obviously Mythic raiding presents an overall higher challenge because you have to organize a bunch of people together to get it done. Sure, fair enough. Absolutely fair enough on that point. But I do personally enjoy Mythic Plus. But if I'm going to have to do the same content on a much higher difficulty in the same groups and the same pugs, yeah, guess what? That's going to lead to, I can see it already, a greater deal of elitism, toxicity, and exclusivity, really. That's what that's going to lead to. Instead of bringing people together, instead of getting people of different skill levels to play together, to interact with one another, what Blizzard is going to achieve is the exact opposite. That's my perspective on that. It's good that it seems that they've taken out a lot of the tedious grind that existed in Shadowlands, but as long as they don't grapple with the fundamental issue of the toxic player base that they have, and they have created through their own decisions, that's how long World of Warcraft is still going to remain a miserable experience. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that Dragonflight ends up being successful. I certainly don't want it to fail, to be clear on that. I have personal reasons for that. But I just see the writing on the wall and as it is, and I don't see how this could end well if they don't grapple with this, or if they make it worse by making Mythic Pluses harder. It just feels like the people who design raids and Mythic Pluses, they're so obsessed of the Warcraft logs community, they're so obsessed over pleasing the elitists and the people who are doing like Mythic, the highest level Mythics and tournament stuff, that one of the things that I feel Blizzard ignores is, you have an entire game with a lot of people playing it. How about making the game for those people, not just for the top 1%? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying WoW should be easy. But what I am saying is that Blizzard should concern themselves more, far more than they were already doing, is how does it all look for a normal player? How does it look for a person who isn't spending 12 hours a day or 10 hours a day or anything like that? A person who has a regular job, all that. How does this look? This game feel and play for someone like that? And what kind of opportunities do they have to grow as a player in the game? What kind of experience is a regular person going to have? Because I'll tell you what that experience was for a regular player in Shadowlands. Awful. On many levels. Community levels, toxicity levels, gameplay levels. And if they can tackle that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of problems going forward. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.